Dr. Geert Houben will give you the first presentation about advances in the risk management of unintended presence of allergenic food in manufactured food products. Geert is principal scientist at TNO. Prior to joining TNO in 1996, he held various positions at the University of Utrecht. He also holds a research position at the University Medical Center in Utrecht. Geert was trained as a biologist and toxicologist. His major scientific specializations are risk assessment in food allergy, food and feed toxicology, and immunotoxicology.
Welcome everybody, and thank you very much, Roland, for handing over the floor. Food allergy, as you all will know, is a potentially lethal condition with a relatively high prevalence in the Western population. And there is no prevention possible for a food allergy, and there's no cure available. And that means that allergic consumers mainly manage their condition by avoidance of allergenic foods, and that makes food allergy, besides a health issue, also a food safety issue. You may all be aware of the precautionary or may contain warnings that often can be seen on food products. These are meant to warn allergic consumers for possible unintended allergen presence in a product and to protect companies from claims. Unfortunately, these precautionary warnings seem to lack a correlation with actual risks of the presence of non-ingredient allergens in food. And I mentioned on this slide several studies with examples. And if you look at these studies, you will see that in these studies, products with which contain the warning might contain the allergens in let's say 6.5 to 95% of the cases, but also products without a warning often contain the allergen. And stakeholders around the world agree that there is a need for quantitative guidance for precautionary labeling. And an example to illustrate the importance of this is a study that we did about 5 years ago. And this slide shows you the result of this study. What we did in this study is we analyzed food products with on the markets in the Netherlands. These were chocolate products, dark chocolate products, and we analyzed them for the presence of milk proteins in these products. And we found quite some levels of milk proteins in these products, as you see here on the x-axis. And by using a computerized risk assessment method that we have developed, we calculated the risk on allergic reactions in the population due to these concentrations of milk proteins. And as you can see here, quite some percentage of the population will be at risk for allergic reactions due to these allergen concentrations. There are 2 countries in the world that have set thresholds for precautionary labeling of allergens in food products, and that is Switzerland and Japan. And they set thresholds of 1,000 ppm and 10 ppm respectively. Although this is of value in some cases, we need to consider that these thresholds may pose some problems in some cases. And I illustrated that on this slide, because if you would assume a food product of which you have an intake of 200 grams, then the allergen intake for a portion of food with an allergen at the threshold level would be 200 milligram or 2 milligram in Japan, in Switzerland and Japan respectively. And if we look at threshold distributions derived from various studies, here on the right-hand side, for instance, you see that with these thresholds for Switzerland and Japan, there are quite some food allergens for which a very high proportion of the allergic population may show allergic reaction with an intake of about 200 or 2 milligram of allergen. Several years ago, there has been a development in Australia and New Zealand organized by the Allergen Bureau, trying to deliver an approach for precautionary labeling based on reference doses and action levels. And I would like to present you a little bit information on a vital scientific expert panel of which I had the privilege to be part of, that worked for this Allergen Bureau and tried to establish reference doses for deriving concentration action levels for precautionary labeling. And I'll lead you through the process that this expert group followed, because establishment of action levels for precautionary labeling should be done by a stepwise process. And I'll show you three important steps of this process in a few slides. The first step is actually to agree with stakeholders on the safety level that you want to achieve, or phrased other way, what is the accepted risk level that you accept as stakeholders together. Because 100% safety is not feasible, we all know that, and you have to agree on a certain level of safety or risk that you agree on. And this is to be done through a risk analysis process in which you take into consideration the feasibility from a scientific point of view, what are the limitations for compliance, can you monitor what you want to achieve, can you enforce it, what is the effect on food choice, and is a choice that you make acceptable to all stakeholders. And this process should lead to an optimum balance seeking in terms of these considerations, and that can lead to an accepted residual risk level. And the vital expert panel, in consultation with stakeholders, took a residual risk level of maximally 1% mild objective reactions in the allergic population, the allergic users of a certain product, as an acceptable balance, taking into consideration that its incidental effects would in general be mild and transitory, and generally requiring no medical intervention. With that in mind, we used data from a big threshold data mining project that TNO started, and we conducted that study in collaboration with the Food Allergy Research and Resources Program from Nebraska University, with my friend Joe, who will give a second presentation as an important collaborator. And in collaboration with FARP, we set up a big threshold database that we continuously expand and update since 2011 and have registered in the eDepot. And in this database, we have data allowing us to modulate the threshold curves of the allergic population. And we use those curves to derive reference doses for major allergenic foods with using this accepted risk level as a starting point. Now, if we have this 1% risk level that we take as a starting point for precautionary labeling thresholds, and we have reference doses for major allergenic foods, for instance, for peanut protein 0.2 milligram, which is a dose, then on the basis of this, you can calculate action levels, which are concentration action levels in food by using food intake assumptions. The Allergen Bureau has a website in which they have a calculator in which you can fill in a food consumption figure, and when you then update this calculator, you get a list of action levels for food products, for allergens in food products, depending on the level of intake that you take as a starting point for the calculations. However, it is very important to select an appropriate intake figure in this way of calculating. And I'll like to illustrate that here with an example. And the example is peanut residues in brown wheat bread. For peanut protein, the reference dose, as I already mentioned, is 0.2 milligram of peanut protein, as calculated by the Vital Experts panel. If you would assume a food intake of 35 grams, which is a portion size of one slice of bread, which is from a nutritional point of view used as a recommended portion size of bread in the Netherlands, so one slice of bread, then the average intake is about 35 grams of brown wheat bread. And if you would use that intake in combination with the 0.2 milligram reference dose, you would calculate an action level of 5.7 ppm. However, we all know that if you eat bread, that most people would eat more than one slice of bread. And the P95 of the actual intake of brown wheat bread in the Netherlands is 210 grams of bread. And if you would use that as a starting point, your action level would be 1 ppm. And you can imagine that these action levels reflect different risks when used in risk calculation. And I illustrated that here using our computerized risk assessment program again. If you would have an action level of 1 ppm of peanut protein in brown wheat bread, that would correspond with an actual risk in the population of 1.0% as calculated in our program. And that is exactly the maximum risk taken as a starting point. So that would be a very accurate and correct action level. However, if you would use the other starting points, one slice of bread, with a 5.7 ppm action level, the risk would be 3.5%, and you immediately see that's higher than the 1% risk taking as a starting point. So this illustrates the importance of an appropriate intake figure to be selected. After the work that the Vital Expert panel did, an ILSI Europe Food Allergy Task Force expert group was also considering these kind of approaches, and the expert group from thresholds to action levels assessed the Vital approach developed for Australia and New Zealand, and basically adopted the approach. But in the assessment, the expert panel particularly considered the importance of selecting an appropriate intake figure, and indeed confirmed that some guidance in this respect might be of value to make the application of the Vital approach easier for companies. The expert panel also considered whether risks indeed remain at or below the accepted risk level when using this approach. And various scenarios were assessed and analyzed, and the conclusions were yes, the risks indeed are at or below 1% taking as a start point. They also considered whether there might be important differences among countries, and also using different scenarios that were studied and different countries and databases from different countries, the conclusions were that there were not real important difference between various countries. And the last important thing of the assessment of the expert panel was that they considered whether a risk of a meal including 2 or more food products that may all be contaminated with the same allergen would pose a risk higher than 1% or not. And the outcome was that in the case of incidental trace scenarios, for instance, situations where only 10% of the food products are contaminated, then the risks will be below the accepted risk level taken as a starting point. On the basis of these analyses, the expert panel prepared a report, and in 2012 organized an international stakeholder meeting together with the Food Allergy Research and Resources Program, Health Canada, ILSI Japan and North America, and the University in Nebraska. Representatives from all continents were present, including patient organizations, industry, governmental, clinicians, and dietitians, and representatives from science. And the ILSI expert panel report was presented and discussed at this meeting. And the outcomes of this meeting were that all stakeholders agreed that a consistent and transparent set of reference doses as a basis for action levels would be a desirable approach. Data from food challenge studies were considered the appropriate foundation from which these action levels could be derived. And the stakeholders also said, well, we have sufficient data now to move forward. We can always wait for more information, but we have a big data set at this moment, and let's move forward with what we have at this moment. And the proposed reference doses by the Vital Expert Panel and the ILSI allergy, Food Allergy Task Force Expert Panel were considered a reasonable first pass to minimize risk to the allergic consumers while maintaining food choices for these consumers. However, appropriate training, education, and communication would be very important. And particularly with respect to the communication, it is very important that the consultation meeting emphasize that with any system, if no precautionary warning is needed, it is very important that there is a possibility to communicate that a positive decision has been taken, that no precautionary warning is necessary. Because in the absence of precautionary warning, allergic consumers need to know whether a product has been assessed according to this system or not. And that, to me, is a very important central conclusion from this meeting, also published by Hattersley et al. In Food and Chemical Toxicology in 2014, which I would like to acknowledge because that was a very important basis and source for my presentation. Okay, thank you very much. I hope I gave you a very clear introduction on the risk management approaches in food allergy and the development of reference doses and action levels. And I would like to acknowledge in particularly ILSI Europe for their collaboration and organizing this webinar, and our friends from the Food Allergy Resource and Resources Program of the Nebraska University. Thank you very much.